All right, what's up, everybody? Mr. Shea here. This week, my students, we've been looking at some of the big business leaders, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. But obviously, that's only a few people, and the majority of people that are impacted by the changes in business and especially production are the workers. So, this is also the time where workers really start to advocate for themselves, and we start seeing the government really shift in some cases as to really what they do about that. So let's kick it. We get some tea. Life is good. And yeah, the rise of labor. So first off, when it comes to labor in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, we really are seeing this become a movement in many ways because of the amount of people that are in that industry. So if you look at these two tables and charts here, we have the American labor force in general is changing. We have this huge shift from agricultural work. 50% of the population in the 1870 to only 30 years later, that drops down to only 31%. So a huge shift in just what jobs people are working. And if you notice, the two big winners of workers, I don't know if that's a way to put it, are commerce, so shipping, movement of goods. Because the US is producing so much, we then have to move it, as well as manufacturing and construction. So my students in class, we looked at that idea that with steel, we are building up. So with construction of cities and buildings, but then the manufacturing of goods as well. And secondly, we're going to look at this more next week, but these people are moving into cities. So we are seeing a huge growth in the urban areas and a huge drop in the population of those rural areas. So we have a lot of people that are moving into the cities to work in these factories. And with all of those people very tightly together, the rise of unions, which we'll talk about in a second, is much more easy to happen. So why are we getting labor organized in the first place? Well, number one, the working conditions for workers are pretty terrible. So we have a lot of those workers working in factories on average between 55 and 60 hours a week. So in many cases, you have people that are working 6 days a week in these factories, long hours, few breaks, if any. And in those factories themselves, you do have very few, if any, safety regulations that are imposed by the government. And since safety devices are expensive, most companies choose not to put them in, if they even exist in the first place. So the conditions are rather dangerous. And in the image on the right, you do see children. There's a large percentage of children that are working in these factories. So with the lack of real child labor laws, say that a few times fast, there is a large amount of children that are working. So these conditions are leading to a lot of deaths. Just in 1900, just in the railroad industry, which actually had pretty good data on this, 2,550 railroad workers were killed. And that's just in 1 year. So we have thousands of workers that are being killed on the job every year. And if you want a comparison, in 1999, only 56 workers were killed that were railroad workers. So the conditions are killing the people that are working there. So with these long hours, the pay isn't great, the work is dangerous. That's where we start to see the rise of labor unions. And labor unions are organizations of workers that are uniting for a common goal. And that's basically it. This union here, the symbol for it, this is the Knights of Labor. It was really the first major labor union that found success in the United States that got a lot of members included. And really the purpose of these labor unions, when we talk about what were conditions like, they had three main goals. Number one, they wanted to have 40-hour work weeks. Second, they wanted higher wages. And third, they wanted safer working conditions. And those were the three major tenets for a lot of these unions. For a lot of them, like Knights of Labor, that working hours was one of the big ideas they wanted to focus on. If you look at that first slide, we have that idea of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours to do what we will. So there is that belief back in the early 1900s that it isn't simply just rest and work, but there is that idea that we should be given time to waste. Because in that time to waste, you have families, you have ideas that you can start. So this idea of working only 40 hours has a lot of benefits for the population. So for these unions, they are thousands of workers, hundreds of thousands of workers in some cases, that are banding together. And the idea of putting workers together is that with that many people advocating for a common goal, then businesses are more willing to listen and enact changes because they know there's so many people that support those changes. And it's not simply just support. Labor unions do have a variety of methods at their disposal to force businesses that are less willing to make changes. So there's everything. There's a ton of different methods, but some include slow down strikes. So if you're working in a factory, you're just going to work slower than you normally would. And what that does, it cuts production, so it makes businesses lose money. But it's hard to figure out if you're a supervisor if people are working slower than normally should, because it's not really that evident. So it's a pretty effective device. If that wasn't working, sometimes workers would break equipment, which would also cause delays. So there's ways to kind of sabotage businesses themselves in that if the administration of that business wasn't helping. To help the public perception of it, there are a lot of marches, which workers are engaged in that have many signs, chants, slogans that really tries to get the public support on their side. But remember, unions are pretty new at this time, so there's a lot of people around the United States that are pretty skeptical of them because they are seeing the growth that's coming out of these industries, and there's a fear that workers trying to get perhaps more than they deserve in some people's eyes could be hurting the United States. Boycotting of goods. So with so many unions that span so many industries, if one union is on strike, often other unions would support those strikes by boycotting the goods that are being sold. So that's a pretty effective device. And as I just mentioned, strikes, walking out of the job, generally the last resort for a lot of unions, because if you walk out, you're not getting paid. You risk getting fired. So strikes are really the final tactic that is used by unions, and it's in fact used many times. There's 37,000 strikes in the early 1900s. In the first, I believe it's 10 years of the 1900s. So you have a huge amount of strikes that are being implemented to get those goals of the workers. This image here is from Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's known as the Bread and Roses Strike because, yes, the people wanted bread to survive, but they also wanted beauty because of that third part of what they're looking for is they also aren't simply just workers, they are people. So they also wanted roses to get sent as well. So that the Bread and Roses Strike is actually one of the first strikes that unites immigrants because it was pretty hard to organize people that spoke different languages. And Bread and Roses Strike was one of the first that did that. Lawrence at one time produced 80% of all textiles in the world. So there were a lot of workers that had the biggest factory in the world that were able to go on strike there. We also have one of the most impactful strikes is the Haymarket Strike. So Haymarket Strike is in Chicago. It happens at Haymarket Square. And during this strike, a bomb is set off by anarchists, so people that are opposed to the government, and it kills a number of police officers, which does a few things. Number one, it really turns a lot of people off to the union movement because of the violence that's associated with it. It also kind of heralds in the Labor Day that we have and we celebrate to remember people that were killed in the strike, as well as remember the goals that workers are, even to this day, fighting for. We also have a few other strikes that really shows how the government is struggling to respond to this. Because remember, there's a hard separation between the government and these big businesses because they have had so many close connections with business leaders. So if you're getting financial support from Andrew Carnegie, it's hard to support his workers where it will cut into his profits. So one of the more famous strikes that happens in the United States is the Homestead Strike. It happens at one of Carnegie's steel mills. Workers go on strike. The Carnegie, Andrew or Fisk, whose name I'm forgetting right now, he calls in the Pinkertons, which are essentially a mercenary group. They, at one point, open fire on some of the workers. A number of workers are killed. And eventually, the National Guard is brought in by the governor of Pennsylvania, takes over the mill, and really ends the strike there. We also have the Pullman strike that happens in Chicago, where workers for the railroads go on strike because their wages are cut. Over 150,000 workers are on strike during that one. At one point, mail cars are stopped from moving on the railroads, which if you stop the mail from being delivered, it is a federal offense. So Grover Cleveland actually, as president, sends in federal troops to end that strike and get the all transit flowing again. However, he does kind of see the future, and shortly after the Pullman strike ends, he does push forward legislation that creates Labor Day. So the government, while they are trying to support business generally more than the workers, they do kind of see that if they don't get the people that vote for them on their side, perhaps they won't be in office much longer. But overall, generally, the government does support business over the goals of those workers, because in many ways, the workers are seen as socialists, as anarchists, as really anti-government in general. So with those brands, it's hard for the government to support them, even though in some cases, those brands were very wrong. In other cases, they were right on. There's a couple of unions that are formed, like the Industrial Workers of the World, also nicknamed the Wobblies. Those are actually anarchists and socialists. So some of them were pretty upfront in the fact that they really disagreed with how government was structured and how we saw the rule of law. Now, for many of these unions, women were excluded. In many cases, immigrants were excluded. So especially for women, by the time we hit 1900, 19% of women are working. So it's certainly not as high as a percentage as men. However, with that many women in the United States working, if they're excluded from the male labor unions, they end up starting their own unions. So there's a variety of textile worker unions that get created to really give a space for women to unite. In these images here, they are protesting, they go on marches, and we will look next week for my students at the Triangle Fire, where women really do get out onto the streets and fight for the rights that are being denied to them. So with all that, we have finally the workers trying to fight against these big businesses to get a cut of the money, these fantastic profits that the business owners are making. And the impacts are certainly still seen today, with many unions very strong, not as strong as they used to be. But we will, last week we saw the auto workers on strike. So this is a start of a movement that is still continuing very much today. So my students in class next week, we're going to dig a bit deeper, especially with child labor, especially with women workers, and get some more good info. All right, we'll catch you later.